This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for April 21st, 2019, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Christina Roach.
What's up, cuboids?
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
And not as usual, guest Stuart Robbins.
Hi, astronauts.
We have a great show for you today. Stuart is going to look at putting planetary pictures in their proper place. His whole segment will be alliterative, so I look forward to that. And I'll be discussing nature documentary suffering. But first, Notre Dame and Assassin's Creed. Pat?
All right. As I'm sure everyone is aware, earlier this week on April 15th, a fire broke out beneath the roof of the Notre Dame Cathedral just before 7 p.m. local Paris time. By the time the fire was extinguished, 15 hours later, the building's iconic spire and most of the roof had collapsed. I read it could take several weeks or even months to assess the cost of the damage, but by all accounts, it's quite extensive. President Emmanuel Macron has announced he wants to see Notre Dame Cathedral rebuilt, quote, more beautiful than before. And he wants to do it within 5 years, but there are warnings that the repairs could take decades and will involve substantial challenges. It seems the main problem is that replacing the oak beams is not an option because such materials simply do not exist in France any longer.
Yeah, I actually read that. We're talking 800 years ago, old growth forest, and they just don't have those trees available anymore.
Well, the one thing that they do have is some money. On Wednesday, headlines suggested that 880 million euros, that's just shy of $1 billion US, has been raised in a day and a half for the reconstruction. Now, that is a lot of money. I expect that Darren probably has some thoughts on that, but that's what my segment is not about.
A lot of
I just want to say, if you're looking for a good charity, GiveWill.org is a great place to start. That's it.
So one company that made a large donation is French video game company Ubisoft.
Wait,
Quote,
Pat, how do you actually pronounce that?
We will get to that. So here's an excerpt from their blog post. Quote, in light of Monday's events, we will be donating 500,000 euros to help with the restoration and reconstruction of the cathedral. We encourage all of you who are interested to donate as well. In addition, we want to give everyone the chance to experience the majesty and beauty of Notre Dame the best way we know how. For 1 week, we will be giving Assassin's Creed Unity away free on PC for anyone who wants to enjoy it. And there are other headlines regarding Assassin's Creed and Notre Dame, which is what I want to focus on. There are a lot of headlines suggesting that a model of Notre Dame Cathedral in the video game could actually be used to help rebuild it.
I read the same thing.
Here are a couple of the articles. Screen Rant. The details of Assassin's Creed game are so good that they could help the city of Paris rebuild the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this from New York Post. A video game could hold the key to the restoration of the fire-ravaged Notre Dame Cathedral. And this from Business Insider. The effort to rebuild Notre Dame Cathedral could get help from an unlikely source, a video game.
Color me a little skeptical.
The effort to publish an article for what I need to do for this magazine baits me into this topic.
My first question would be, the details might be quite detailed, but are they accurate enough?
Right.
Right. Okay, so what about this? Assassin's Creed Unity is an action-adventure video game developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published by Ubisoft. It was released in November 2014. Notre Dame is featured heavily in the game both as the setting of a mission and one of the central architectural features of the game. Artists and historians working to create the game spent 14 months combing through photos and videos to create a digital model so realistic that some have speculated it could help to guide the reconstruction of the 12th century cathedral.
Pat, did you see any videos of the game?
I did walk through it, yeah. So I thought this was pretty cool. The idea that a 3D model in a video game could be used to rebuild Notre Dame Cathedral. But is it true? The historian Maxime Darren, who worked on the game, told Canadian paper La Presse that the designers had taken some, quote, artistic liberties. Cedric Gauchard, the head of Life 3D, the company that modeled the cathedral for the renovation work that was underway when the fire happened, added that while the game makers had done an impressive job, a model based on photographs and maps was not accurate enough to do the job. Ubisoft agrees, saying that the model of Notre Dame found in the game is an artistic creation and not a scientific one. The Globe and Mail actually has an interesting article on this as well. They have an interview with Robert Bork, a world expert in the precision measurement and layout of Notre Dame Cathedral. Yes, that is what he's an expert in.
How niche.
Bork has done his own Notre Dame recreations using laser measurements gathered from 1 billion data points.
I was going to ask that question if you hadn't brought it up of, do they have laser-based mapping of the cathedral? Because I remember that after September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks in New York in the United States, that I think it was the National Park Service started to take laser measurements and basically mapping the exteriors and maybe even the interiors of several landmarks, including the Statue of Liberty and the Washington Monument. Someone should double check that, but I'm pretty sure that they did that. And so I was wondering, like, has this expanded to other countries, especially in the age of, well, terrorism? Have people taken steps to try to map out some of these important monuments and landmarks so that if something does happen, can they be recreated? And it sounds like with this case, they did.
So Bork had this to say about the model. He said, "This is really cool. This is impressive. All that they had when I was a kid was Pong." But within 7 seconds of looking at the game, he spots flaws. Quote, "Oh, I see their Notre Dame is supposed to be medieval. They've added elements from the 19th century. What they did is good for what it is, but it's not designed for this process." So there you have it. As cool as it sounds, it doesn't appear that a video game is going to be used to rebuild the cathedral. As a side note, I wanted to mention, as Stuart also mentioned, a very typical thing that happens when I research stuff on TRC. Now, I'm sure my fellow panelists have had the same experience.
No, never.
If you look at the show notes, you'll see I looked at over a dozen articles for this segment. One thing I wanted to do is make sure that I was pronouncing Ubisoft correct. So I looked it up and I found an article by Polygon titled, "How do you pronounce Ubisoft? The answer is more complicated than you might think."
Of course it is.
It includes a video which was uploaded to their YouTube channel where staffers of the video game company around the world weigh in on the pronunciation. Some say Ubisoft, some say Ubisoft, and some say Ubisoft. CEO of the company, Yves Guillemot, says, "If you're speaking with a native English speaker, it's Ubisoft. When you're speaking with a native French speaker, it's Ubisoft. But you can pronounce it any one of the three ways." All that to say, nothing is ever simple.
Nope.
So actually with the pronunciation, I have a query for the people in the room who speak French. Because I, as an ignorant American, I don't speak no French no good. So I was wondering, how do you actually pronounce Notre Dame? Because, Pat, in your segment, you both said Notre Dame and Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And I just did it with a little bit of a Spanish accent, so I'm curious.
So in French, Notre Dame.
And you would say Notre.
Yeah.
Notre Dame.
So there's there's some phlegm in there.
Not so much.
Okay.
Not so much.
Not that I over-exaggerated a bit, but it's Notre.
Okay.
Yeah. Notre being our and Dame being lady.
Thanks, Pat. We can learn more about the importance of photos and pictures from Stuart, who's going to put planetary photos and pictures in their proper place.
Right. So I'm going to talk about what has been sort of consuming my life for the last year and a half, and that is the fascinating world of planetary cartography. Cartography is, most people think of it as map making.
Right.
I think of it as my life for the last year and a half. So this all came about because my PhD thesis was creating a global Mars crater database. This was a database of about 640,000 craters that I hand-circled and did all this stuff with and got a piece of paper that says I'm smart now. And so after that, I found out that there was more and better data that is now available, as tends to happen in planetary science because we have decent funding at this point, but more money is good. So what I wanted to do was I discovered that my database was inaccurate in various places, especially when viewed with better images. So I had used data that was taken at about 100 meters, or roughly 330 feet per pixel. Sounds big, but when you're talking about an entire planet, that's still a lot of data. This new data set that I was looking at had pictures at 6 meters per pixel, or about 20 feet or so. So that's still fairly big, but again, we're talking about an entire planet, and we're talking about terabytes of data. And when I was looking at these images, I thought, well, these craters look a heck of a lot better, and I can do a lot more stuff and get a lot more science out of them if I were able to use these images. Problem was, when I used the standard software that we use in planetary science to project these images from a rectangle into something that's not a rectangle and put them in their location on the planetary surface, stuff was in the wrong place.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So the issue is that we track spacecraft from the ground, and we also issue commands to the spacecraft saying, do this thruster burn, or take an image here and control the camera this way. Mm-hmm. And then we use that information to try to reconstruct where the spacecraft was when, how it took pictures, how it was oriented, all of these things in order to use that information to project the images onto the surface. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that these data, regardless of how accurate we try to make them, are not going to be necessarily correct. So what can we do about that? Well, what we can do is, again, what has been consuming my life for the last year and a half. And that is I took a deep dive, just like a TRC segment, into the world of planetary cartography. So the way that we make the spacecraft data go where we want them to go is that we have to align features. So this is a painstaking process where we look at, say, 2 images that overlap, and we find a feature, usually another planet's a crater. We find a feature that is imaged in both images in that overlap, and we make a point that says this pixel in image A must project to the same location on the planet's surface as this other pixel in picture B. So the problem is, and the reason that this takes forever, and the reason that people haven't really done this for this particular data set on Mars, is that we are talking, as I said, about terabytes of data. Each image that I'm looking at, and there are, at this point, 105,000 images taken by the spacecraft. Each image is about 5,000 pixels across and about 50,000 pixels tall.
Wow.
And we're talking about 105,000 of them scattered across all of Mars. And because this particular camera is not a framing camera, so it's not like if you take a professional camera, you take a picture, you have a CCD chip in there or a CMOS chip or something in there, which might be like saying ATM machine, but that's a separate issue. It's not a framing camera, it's a line scan camera, and that's why we get pictures that are so long. It's basically a scanner.
Right.
A scanner across the surface of Mars. So because it's not a framing camera, we actually have to have tie points along the entire image because the camera or the spacecraft acceleration might change or the velocity might change. We can't assume that it's constant. So we have to make a large number of tie points across every image. And the more images that overlap, the better it is because we have better controls. And so we're talking about literally hundreds of millions to billions of tie points. You can't really do this manually. So what I've been working on over the last year and a half is automated software to try to do this process as automated as possible in order to try to create a fully controlled mosaic of Mars.
And how's that working out for you, Stuart?
Yeah, so NASA rejected my grant last year. So we've been working more on the process this year, as well as marketing to planetary scientists. So this is a case where you have to convince the scientists who are reviewing your grant proposal that you really can do the work.
Yes.
And this work is so mind-numbingly painful, so boring, and so tedious that most people who have tried to do it in planetary science have just done it enough to realize that it's a giant pain in the arse, we'll say, because we're on a family show. And because it's such a pain in the arse to use this software and to do this, especially for so many images and so much data, the proposal review was basically like, we don't believe you can do this. Even though you've done this for 7.5% of Mars, we don't believe that you can do this for the rest of the planet.
Right.
So part of...
Can or would?
We can't. They said they didn't think we actually could. And they also said that some of the software that goes back and tries to solve for the actual spacecraft geometry and the actual camera geometry and movement, they said it can't handle as big of a network of points as you want to make. It's simply not physically possible in computers these days. And so what we have to do is we have to find a way to make it possible, or to demonstrate to the review panel that it is possible, or to reasonably divide the problem up enough so that maybe it's not a global solution, but a solution in 10 parts, say, which is still better than what the status quo is now, where if I have one image with one feature and another image with the same feature, those features can be different in location on the planet by hundreds of meters, which in some cases isn't a big issue, but in other cases it actually is, especially when you want to try to then align that information with other data sets. So we're in an era of planetary science now where we have data for a lot of different bodies in the solar system that are a lot of different kinds of data. So it's not just visible light images, it's infrared images. It's not just images, it's spectra, so data about the composition. It's not just visible light images at a certain pixel scale, it's also visible light images at much better pixel scales. So we have a camera in orbit around Mars right now that's taking pictures not at 6 meters per pixel, but 25 centimeters per pixel. So for those who are American like me, we're talking about something that's about 10 inches across, so the size of a large dinner plate. We can actually resolve that on Mars. And now when we're talking about differences of hundreds of meters, we're talking about, is that picture that I am taking of Mars that I think is at that location of that feature, is it going to be in my picture? Because the camera is so high resolution that it might not even be in the picture if our pointing information is just slightly off. So planetary cartography is actually really important, really mind-numbingly difficult, and it lacks automation these days. So the tools that we've been creating over the last year and a half to do this are sort of unique in the planetary science community, because most people who do this, which is actually very, very few, it's like a dozen people do this. Most people who do this, it's all manual. So it is literally clicking on different features and then doing a blink comparison. So where you see the feature in one image and then you see it in the other, just sort of at, 2 hertz. So once every half a second, it flips between them. And then you literally nudge using the arrow keys, the image around to try to get it to be at the correct location.
So it's like old school astronomy where they would compare plates.
Right.
Almost.
So this is how Pluto was discovered, by blink comparison. And it's, as I said, mind-numbingly difficult, but we have some pretty good automation tools right now. And I'm not trying to use this podcast as a reference for my NASA proposal this summer, but if any of you happen to be on a NASA review panel and you see something by S. Robbins, we can do it.
So, Stuart, how much information do you have about the velocity and position of the spacecraft when it took the picture?
We don't have that much other than just what we get from ground tracking. Okay. So we have a radio dish on the spacecraft. The dish can send signals back, and we can track the Doppler effect. And so we can see, where the stuff is. And the uncertainty in these positions themselves are on the scale of hundreds of meters from the spacecraft.
Right.
But when the spacecraft is 300 kilometers above the surface of Mars, which is actually a pretty close orbit, a difference of 100 meters in the spacecraft's position can translate to a very large effect in the ground position of where that image projects.
So not perfect, but better than anything we have.
Right. So don't get me wrong. Like the default pointing information isn't horrible. It gets you partway there. And for many people, it's actually good enough. But if I'm trying to create a global crater database and I don't want to repeat myself when I look at a new image and see, oh, this crater is different in location by hundreds of meters, then I have to go back and figure out, well, where should it actually be? And so this was a case where it's actually not uncommon in science, where someone starts off wanting to solve one problem and then goes on a very deep dive for sometimes several years trying to solve a completely different problem in order to then finally get back to the one that they wanted to solve. I had a professor, an undergraduate, who spent 5 years studying, I think it was low mass red dwarf stars, just because she had to revise a standard star catalog so she could do the actual science she wanted to do on a completely different type of star. So I thought that this would be sort of an interesting topic, if perhaps a mind-numbing topic and one that people don't think about a lot, but an interesting topic nonetheless for TRC, because it shows that scientists don't necessarily have a linear thought process, which might not surprise any of you if you've ever talked to one. But we don't necessarily have a linear process of going from one kind of project to another. It's often going off in tangents and doing things that are, well, to use the Monty Python phrase, and now for something completely different.
Well, and as you say, sometimes you have to solve one problem before you can get to the original problem.
Right.
I think you might want to change your elevator pitch, though, Stuart. Putting the emphasis on mind-numbingly boring may be hurting you.
Well, this is why I watch a lot of Judge Judy.
Your segment is great for a variety of reasons. One, I think people inadvertently assume scientists just do their thing and it's not that complicated. So they see photos in the paper or somewhere else, Mars, and they don't realize just how complicated it was to do it, let alone all the other variables you mentioned, nor did I. Second, I think people probably have two different intuitions in someone in competition, that a photo is just a photo of what's there. It's not that hard. You just take a photo. Why is that so complicated? But then they also know if they've ever taken a photo, it doesn't quite show what's there. But as you mentioned, the idea that it's not in a normal frame, so to speak, and you're scanning across, and if the thing's moving, it really highlights just how complicated this is. Yeah. And we only get to see all these wonderful things and all the stuff the scientists do because people are working really hard to try to figure out these problems. So that's fantastic. Hopefully it'll be solved somewhat sooner rather than later. Maybe there's some machine learning person listening who wants a really good thesis.
Yeah, well, actually, so I do work with a machine learning person who came to me wanting to do automated crater detection. That's a completely different topic, maybe a different TRC episode. But I recently broached this issue to him because the problem is that the software that we use was really written in the 70s and 80s. And so it has some automated matching routines in there, but the field of computer science, I think this should be obvious to anyone, the field of computer science has really advanced a lot since the 1980s.
Yep.
And advances in machine learning and vision have advanced quite a bit. And so when I said, hey, this is something else I'm working on, or you may be interested, he said, this sounds a lot more interesting than the stuff I'm working on now, which is trying to detect shoplifters. So yeah, it's a field that is rife for updating. And again, I think that might have been the issue with the review panel was a lot of people, when we review these NASA grants, including myself, if you come out and say, I have this completely new method to do this, and it is literally orders of magnitude faster than anything anyone has come up with before, that's going to be met with a lot of skepticism. And I'm sure people on this show are used to skepticism.
Burn him.
Yeah. But we do have that problem in science of sometimes skepticism is just too much. And the question comes to, well, I have 15 pages in my grant proposal. How do I really convince a panel that I can do this while also arguing that it's important to do and everything else that I have to do, like show relevance to NASA and show my work plan and all this other kinds of stuff. So it's hard to do. This is why the soft money field of science is certainly not for everyone, because it is a big rat race, and sometimes it's a real crapshoot of whether you got the right panelists who can vouch for you and say, no, really, they really can do this, as opposed to those who say, nah, I don't believe them at all.
Thanks, Stuart. We started with images of something on Earth and then images of different planets. And now we're going to talk about images in a documentary about our planet. I'm going to talk to you about nature documentary suffering. Netflix recently released a nature documentary called Our Planet, narrated by David Attenborough. I had just assumed initially this was footage mishmashed from Planet Earth, Frozen Planet, Blue Planet, and all the other ones.
All the leftover
all
footage.
The planets, exactly. Shame on me. Quoting Wikipedia, it has been 4 years in the making and it was filmed in 50 countries with over 600 crew members taking part in production. The series addresses issues of conservation while featuring these disparate animals in their respective home regions. It marked the first nature documentary Netflix has ever made. The series focuses on the breadth of the diversity of habitats around the world, including the Arctic wilderness, the deep sea, the vast landscapes of Africa, and the diverse jungles of South America. Before knowing this, I did watch the first episode, and it was great. It looked like new footage, too, because it was. Anyway, this documentary has started getting some headlines about it containing disturbing footage.
I've read this on Twitter. Some people were very upset. People said they were crying.
Yes. CBC's The Current, which is a podcast I like and listen to, had a segment about this, and then they also had an article on their website, which is linked to in the show notes, trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
Quote, after complaints from parents, our Planet director defends footage of walruses plummeting to their death. That's the headline. And then it even says this, warning, some readers may find details of this story disturbing. So it's not enough to say there's something going on here where people are disturbed, but then, of course, the article itself also has to have a warning associated with it. What's going on? Quoting the article about the podcast, the documentary shows walruses plunging from a cliff to their deaths has provoked condemnation from some parents who were caught unaware as they watched with their children. Janice Duddy told The Current that it took an hour for her 8-year-old son Toby to calm down after he watched the scene. Walruses need to have a place to rest while out hunting for food. They often use sea ice. With a warming climate, there is less sea ice, so that means fewer places to rest and more exhaustion. And thus, places like rocks and cliffs become more crowded. So crowded that some fall off the cliff and die. The Current interviewed Sophie Lanphier, who directed and produced that episode, and she said they reflected long and hard on whether to show the footage, because it was one of the hardest things she's ever filmed. But it is important to highlight how climate change is causing suffering. On April 10th, Netflix tweeted out, as you make your way through our planet, here are some moments animal lovers may want to skip, and then they listed various times in the documentaries. And here's a quote, the scenes flagged included a flamingo chick's legs solidified in salt deposits, a penguin being eaten by killer whales, and fish caught in fishing nets. Well, what are the responses here? Some say this is exactly what our planet, the real thing, is like, so people should deal with it.
Real talks, people.
There we go. I think we can be more sympathetic to crying children who are bothered by suffering. And I'll actually admit that when I saw the baby flamingo's chick's legs covered in salt and the implication it just died, I did find it saddening. But I couldn't help but think of the frequent horrors that nature documentaries show that no one seems to care about. Crocodile eats a zebra, lion pounces on something. And these are often slowed down so we can watch in all their gory glory.
Yeah.
True.
But people don't seem to experience sadness and disgust at these moments. Now, one scene in this first episode involved a huge school of fish being attacked from above by dive-bombing birds and eaten from below and the sides by other fish and possibly dolphins. It was a massacre. But that's not how it was presented. He specifically used a word which is not at all like a word like massacre. So I think here's the tempting but wrong statement. People are so hypocritical. Look how stupid they are to care about a couple walruses and not care about the larger massacres that are put on for entertainment. But here's what I think we should say. It is good that people care about animal suffering. Let's be compassionate while at the same time engaging in an honest but tactful discussion about why they care about some animal suffering and not others. If the goal is less suffering, and that is the goal of every documentary, but I actually think it's the goal of this one, there are good opportunities for a broader and important discussion about the suffering of other living things. And now I turn to the panel to hear what they think.
So for me, I think that if this disturbs you, good, because the world is disturbing. And also the effects of climate change and a changing environment and all of this stuff is going to really screw up our planet. And you know, again, I don't do this particular kind of research, but I know a lot of people who do, and I trust the research at this point. And the research is saying that literally now to within several years to within several decades, like this is not a long-term thing that we have to worry about in 100 years or 1,000 years. Climate change is an issue that is affecting us now and is going to be affecting us in the next several years. And if this highlights the effects of that and people are disturbed by those effects, I say, good. Maybe that will actually lead to some meaningful policy changes. And I think that policy changes are things that we should discuss, how best to implement these in order to protect the planet. But I think that these issues of, is the science real at this point, is just ridiculous. And I'm sorry I took your question on a slightly different track, but this is something that I still deal with people not uncommonly emailing me saying that climate change is false and fake and all this other stuff. And so, if this documentary helps emphasize that point and it disturbs people, I say good. Maybe they'll actually get off their butts and do something.
Right. And I might say the same thing about the actual violence in the documentary, because in many ways life is suffering. And so the idea that there are horrible things that happen in nature, I always come back to the idea that people shoot game and then use it as food, and people are outraged, but they're more than happy to go to a grocery store and buy meat because they don't realize that factory farming is way more horrible. Mm-hmm. So the idea that people realize that the death of animals and animal suffering can be very cruel and very real, I don't think is a terrible thing.
I don't know, do you guys think maybe as humans we can reconcile it more when it's an animal killing another animal, even if they're destroying the animal? Because that's what they do. They need to eat. They need to feed their cubs. But in this is, when you see these scenes, it's heart-wrenching in a different way, because it's almost, this isn't necessary.
Well, so people really seem to love the naturalistic fallacy, which is usually that, right? Oh, it's natural. Animals have to do it. They have to survive. Like, okay, that doesn't mean it's not horrible.
Yes.
And like, it's sort of like when I say to people, like, yeah, but would you punch your cat in the face? Like, oh, no, that'd be terrible. You're like, right. So this animal being eaten somewhat times alive is more horrible, and yet it doesn't seem to register because it's natural or not. To take the point that, to what extent are humans causing climate change, which I do think they are, the average person might try to seem to like outsource it, so to speak. If it's nature itself causing it, like in a I don't know, climactic sense, they may have been more sympathetic.
Well, they do.
Certainly they do. I was thinking it could be just how the footage is shot. As we know, the documentarian has a lot of tricks in their trade, so to speak. And I think the way in which the walruses were filmed, falling probably in slow-mo to their deaths, contributed to people being more saddened. And to Stuart's point, if you're disturbed, I think that can be good, unless, of course, you're so disturbed you're turned off by it. And the kid might not want to watch any documentary again because he sees it as a traumatic experience, which is not what we want at all.
Right.
But in the right context, yes, if you believe you're sitting down to a family nature show and seeing cute flamingos or something, and then all of a sudden this pops up, yeah, there's a reason that parents can be concerned, but I would hope the parents do watch it with their children, explain to them what's going on. But when those other scenes, as I said, of all these other animals being massacred come up, yeah, those are also bad. They're just not shot that way. The music is up-tempo. It's almost interesting. There's a chase.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be, it's entertainment.
And you're rooting for someone.
Of course, exactly. And then they get away and you're happy. And you're like, well, that means the other person's hungry. And then they suffer. So there's not really a win-win here. It's usually a lose-lose.
Or depending on even how they shoot it, you might be rooting for the predator, because then the predator can feed their child.
Right, exactly. Thanks for joining us, listeners. Today, Pat told us that Notre Dame will not be helped by Assassin's Creed, but will likely be helped by other people using their wonderful scientific LiDAR scanning systems of ancient cathedrals.
Yay, science!
And then more yay science, Stuart talked to us about how exceptionally complicated it is to get some of those nice photos you like to look at of other planetary surfaces. And finally, I talked to you about suffering in nature documentaries, which seems to be differently perceived depending on how it is shot, which makes perfect sense. But I wanted to highlight that there's a lot of suffering, and maybe we should just have more conversations about what it is and why we care about certain parts of it. Until next time, think better, tack better.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Remember, kids, science doesn't suck, it blows.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes, or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries, or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.